Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Eric Jenkins. I'm the account manager for Connecting Up in TechSoup New Zealand, and I would like to welcome you to the second part of the Cyber Risk webinar series, which will be presented again by Monica Schlesinger. Sorry if I've mispronounced that, which I think I just have, from Advisory Boards Group. We'll start with just a little bit of housekeeping here. All the lines are muted, so if you have any questions during the session, just type it in the questions box and Monica will be tackling those at the end of the webinar. Do note that your questions and comments won't be appearing to the entire group. They will just be appearing to me. If you've got any technical issues, just type it out in the question box there and I'll try my best to help you troubleshoot. Otherwise, just for some common issues here, if you're on a Wi-Fi connection or you have multiple programs open, those can sometimes affect the quality of the audio and video of the webinar. So if possible, just close those down just so that you can have the best experience that you can today. Before we start, I'd also like to remind you that the webinar is being recorded, so a link to the recording and the slides will be handed out later. I'll reiterate that at the end of the webinar as well. But otherwise, that's about it for me for this second part here, so I will pass it over to Monica now. Thanks.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for participating today. So we shall go straight into the cyber risk part 2. Given the fact that I will mention a number of legal obligations for directors and organizations today, we introduced a disclaimer. So this actually covers Connecting Up and TechSoup and Advisory Boards Group for the contents of the presentation, and it shouldn't be perceived as legal advice. Last time, we had in the agenda for the part 1, we talked about risk management, cyber risk in the context of risk management and how to identify the cyber risks. Well, I got a question from a gentleman, I believe, called Rob, about how to calculate risks, and in particular cyber risks. So I thought that it would be a good idea to respond to this question today and to give you just an example. Obviously, it will depend on the organization, the type of the organization, the maturity level of the organization. The people who participated may remember that we talked about the CMMI model, the capability maturity model of integration. And it also depends on what you need to protect your main assets. But I thought of giving this example. So we'll start with the definitions. Just imagine that you would be in the organization, and you would want to obtain money and approvals from the board to support you in creating a cyber solution and covering the costs. So if we think of the total cyber risk is a cyber event resulting in a loss, the cyber risk tolerance is how much the board could accept in terms of risk. Some other people call it a risk appetite. The cost of the remediation is your goal, whether you want to find out how much to invest or you want to go straight to the board and ask for money. The residual risk is a risk that remains after the controls are in place and the cyber insurance is considered. I would like to make one mention here with the cyber insurance. I've spoken to many brokers in the industry, and sometimes I feel that organizations take up policies that don't necessarily cover them for what they need. In other words, you need to de-risk your organization before going out and seeking a policy for cyber insurance. Otherwise, many clients that I have seen and spoken to end up with what I call a policy for the right arm, when in reality it's the left leg that hurts them. So you've got to ensure that the policy that you're taking up is actually covering what you can't manage internally. So this is coming from a book. These formulae are coming from a book from the CISA, the cybersecurity auditor, and they calculate. So when you have a cyber auditor coming and looking at the risk, they consider the threat, the vulnerability, times the frequency, and then you get the analyzed risk. So if you have a single loss expectancy, for example, a laptop is destroyed and passwords are stolen and so on, or it is locked by malware, times, and that could, you put a cost to that, times the annual rate of occurrence, that can give you the annual loss expectancy. It is hard to calculate it like that, though. So you need to firstly define what your main assets are, the most important assets. So I'm giving you a practical example here. So I put the definitions again. If, let's give an example, the risk tolerance of your board would be $25,000. Then you get insurance coverage for $5,000, and you had already calculated your inherent risk cost to be $105,000. So the figures that I gave are really small, and they can actually be reflective of a small company. So the inherent exposure, which is $75,000, we derive that figure from 105, the inherent risk. So you do nothing, and your exposure is worth 105K, minus the $5,000 insurance, minus the 25,000 risk tolerance. So your board can accept a risk up to that value. So how can you cover, and what can you do with a risk exposure of 75K? Let's assume that your CEO comes up with a figure of $8,000 to be the total cost of remediation, to put in place policies, to have a cyber health check, to introduce maybe a new IDS, IPS, intrusion detection system, intrusion protection system. This cost will remediate risks worth 55K. So if you think of 75,000, your inherent risk exposure, minus 55K, you end up with a residual risk of $20,000, which is under the risk tolerance of the board. On top of this $8,000 that we calculated here, you need to think of the cost of compliance, so measures to comply with regulation that applies to your organization and your industry. And you also have to think of the cost of audits. You can undertake internal audits, but the best ones are obviously external audits. They are not mutually exclusive. And you have to be prepared for risks eventuating in your BCP, business continuity plan. So I hope this answers the question that was asked last time, and now we can discuss we can go into the second part. I'm sorry, and one thing that I wanted to also mention to you, and perhaps suggest, if you find it difficult to go to the board of directors and ask for money, because this is not really investing in your company viability, so it's not a very clear business case to say, well, I'm investing $100 and will make $10 out of this. I think you have to think to demonstrate to the board what would happen if they approve the money versus what would happen if they don't. So the risk, if spent on cyber, is not approved, could be X dollars. And then if they approve this expenditure, then the residual risk would be whatever you calculate. If you think of compliance, the fines, if the compliance is not achieved, and cost of compliance versus cost of compliance. risk if audits are not carried out versus cost of audits, and BCP with no cyber plan and all-inclusive BCP. So I think that gives you something to justify what you would like to achieve and the money that you want to have approved by the board. So now we're moving into the second part of this webinar, the board and committee level discussions and strategy for cyber, including the director's obligations, the tactical plans to defend against cyber risk, involvement of management and staff, and some practical hints and tips for how to become cyber resilient. So, many boards where I sit, they don't quite look like that, and this is an extreme case. But you have to think that directors have specialized skills in business, in governance, and cybersecurity or technology may be something quite scary. And it's something that they want to push away, to think that it doesn't exist. So I think the discussion has to start, and it has to start at the board level. The best way is to include this in the corporate governance and in the board charter. So I'm a fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and probably about 15 years ago, they used to say that the main obligations of a board were to set policies for goals, partnerships, and ethical behavior. The second one was to manage directors' agenda, accountabilities, and communication. The third one was determine strategic and tactical directions. The fourth point and stream of activity and obligation was to assure the company's the capability of the company's operational and financial management functions, constructively oversee the company's operating performance, and then the sixth one to ensure the corporate renewal and learning. What was quite strange to me, even at that time, was that risk management, the risk strategy, which should come from the board, as we discussed in the part one of this webinar, which includes the management of extreme risks in line with the delegated financial authority, were buried and hidden under the obligation to assure the capability of the company's operational and financial management. So not only that I recommend that that the risk strategy has to be elevated, but also the cyber strategy has to be elevated even more. And one of the organizations that recommends this to elevate cyber risk and place it on the board's table is IOSCO, which is the International Organization for Security Commission. So ASIC is the only Australian member. So any organization that is subject to the Corporations Act and works under ASIC, so the ASIC is the regulator. ACNC, because many not-for-profit organizations are actually reporting through ACNC, and I think, as I mentioned last time, ACNC is now trying to switch on the Corporations Act obligations for directors and bridge this gap and actually make it smaller between not-for-profits and companies that are under the Corps Act. So if we look at the regulatory obligations, the first part, the common law duties. So if your organization is only in one state, and let's say is under an Associations Act, because if you have a national presence, then obviously you would have to be under the Corps Act. The directors have to act honestly, exercise reasonable care and skill, and be diligent. So the reasonable care and skill and diligence is where you can actually expect the directors to be accountable and responsible for the cybersecurity strategy. If your organization is under the Corps Act, there are fiduciary duties. There is the duty of care, skill, and diligence. And this is something that directors can be held responsible for. So this is not an exhaustive list, and I'm giving you a few other examples. Many companies are subject to the Privacy Act with their 13 principles. My Health Records, State Health Records, Freedom of Information Act. You have to think of data export laws, and you'll probably ask yourself, why did I bring this subject here? Because if you have data in the cloud, you do not, unless you have specified or paid for having the data kept in Australian data centers, you may not know where the backup copies are. Organizations that take payments, they have to be aware and keep the credit card details on their servers, have to be PCI DSS compliant, and so on. So this list is not exhaustive. You have to discuss what laws are applicable to your organization with your lawyer or internal counsel. I brought here to everyone's attention the board's cyber duties. In the States, there is the National Association of Company Directors that suggested a few duties. I believe that we should look at the last one in particular. So going through all of them, understand and approach cybersecurity as an enterprise-wide risk, understand the legal implications of cyber risk, have adequate access to cybersecurity expertise, and cyber risk management should be on the board agenda, on the board meeting agenda. Set the expectation for management to establish these cyber and risk management frameworks. And the last one, where I deviated from the NICD, I believe that the directors must create this strategy for cyber risk, and management must have the delegation to create specific plans associated with each approach. If your board understands that it needs to be in charge of the strategy, because again, as directors, we always say, well, we are nose in, hands out. We probe, ask questions, and create strategy, and then hands out means that we delegate the operational responsibilities to the CEO and to the rest of the organization. So the board needs to understand the importance of creating this cyber strategy, and then ask the management to source, to create solutions, to put in place the tactical plans, and cost them, obviously, for the rest of the organization. If you think of how to communicate, how to manage the cyber risks and how to communicate them to the board, I suggest that your board should have a committee. I gave an acronym here, FARMS. This is one example which I created. So I created on a board where I'm the chair, the finance, audit, risk management, and security. In large organizations, you can split. You can have finance and audit separate, risk management and security in a separate committee. The composition of this committee must have the risk manager, one director at least, maybe the CFO, the CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, the CIO. The extreme risks need to go to the board, and the board will create risk strategy and cyber strategy. Reporting has to be done at least on a monthly basis, and what I call the L&D, learning and development. You need to provide, the organization needs to invite various speakers to the board to discuss and suggest perhaps, and consultants to suggest various measures. Compliance is really important, and the audits internal and external. Now, the tactical plans, sometimes you might feel that, as a director, you're playing chess with somebody that is coming from a very different background. So you need to think how you delegate these tactical plans to your management. One example, and the way that I would actually see this at the board level, is many lines of defense, because you've got to be successful every time in defending the organization. The crooks, the criminals, have to be successful only once to be able to penetrate your lines of defense, and then they can that will actually cost you. It may cost you money, it may cost you the reputation of the organization, and very many organizations simply go under once they suffer an attack. So you have to have controls put in place by the staff, HR policies, behavior monitoring, alerts, education, risk analysis, and so on. Management controls, and the management has to ensure that they actually put in place the plans, and that goes to the executive team. The exec team and the CEO controls, and then financial control, security, risk management, quality, audit, compliance should go to this FARMS committee, and then the FARMS committee needs to report to the board of directors and perhaps take there the extreme risks that were beyond their delegate authority and delegate financial authority. The cyber insurance is again one component that can be discussed at the board level. In the United States, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, in other words, made up of many brokers, has already created policies and laws internally for their members to go and discuss about the cyber policies straight to the board of directors. So no longer talk to the IT person or the IT manager or the procurement manager. And there are things that are outside of your control, the external audits and the regulators. So practical hints and tips for how to become cyber resilient. So these are just a few suggestions. Short term, to start off with, you need to know what your cyber posture is and how resilient you are in terms of cyber. So you need to have a cyber health check. Then following that, you need to start to create a strategy at the board level, and you have to initiate a strategic workshop with your management. Then you have to calculate the risks and investment in cybersecurity. The management has to create cyber defense plans, the tactical plans. And also, if you are subject to the Privacy Act and the data breach notification scheme, you need to have a data breach plan so that if and when a data breach happens, you are prepared and you can go with this breach plan to the OAIC, the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, and report it. Medium term, you need to enforce the cyber strategy, oversee tactical plans. You've got to be to organize staff continuous education, board education, and ensure continuous protection. And long term, educate adapt to new technologies and obviously improve the governance. So we now have time for a few questions. So I will pass it. I will pass the control back to Eric and see if there were any questions.
Thanks for that, Monica. We haven't got any questions yet, but if you have got any questions right now, please do send them through the next minute or so. Otherwise, I'll just go through the standard outro here. So obviously, thank you very much, Monica, for presenting. That was very good. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you all managed to learn a lot. Like I said, do chuck any questions through if you've got now. If you don't have any questions now, or if they come to mind later, please just let us know. Feel free to reach out to Monica. She's got her details up there, or feel free to send an email through to events@connectingup.org, and we can handle that offline as well. Like I mentioned, obviously, Monica's got all her information out there as well, so you can reach out to her directly. If you want to subscribe to her newsletter, you can do that as well. Otherwise, just to reiterate, this has been recorded. And the slides and the recording will be sent through to you all, typically within a few business days after we get that all up on the website. Otherwise, that's just about it from me. Monica, is there anything else you want to add here?
No, thank you so much to everybody, and I strongly recommend that you actually have a discussion with your CEO and your boards and look at the cyber posture, because according to the Ponemon Institute, about 60% of the organizations that get breached will go out of business within 6 months. So it is something that won't go away. Thank you.
Not a problem. Thank you again, Monica, and everyone, enjoy the rest of your day. We hope to see you all next time. Thanks again for joining us.